So if you want to send it to any friends, family afterwards, please feel free. So thank you everybody for joining me this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Eve Turow Paul, author of the book Hungry. This is the second session of the Hungry Book Club, the second of 3. And today we're going to be tackling the topic of loneliness and culture. And I'm going to give just a brief presentation just to introduce you all to myself, to my work. This is a unique book club in that you don't actually have to have read the book in order to enjoy and participate in this conversation, though I do encourage all of you to go pick up a copy. And every registrant should have received a 30% off discount code if you didn't get it for some reason. Shoot the organizers an email. I want to start by introducing myself, but before I do that, I also want to give a big thank you to the Future Food Network, who have been the amazing hosts of this entire series. And thank you to the wonderful Sarah Reversi. If you all are not familiar with Future Food Network, Future Food Institute, I encourage you to look them up. They're doing amazing work as it relates to food and climate initiatives. They're a massive ecosystem running innovation sprints for companies, and then also running boot camps, educational sessions for professionals and for students. So again, I'm Eve Turow Paul. I am the founder of an organization called Food for Climate League. I have also spent the last 12 years working as a food writer. Started off by doing things like recipe development, writing about food history, and then became completely obsessed with human behavior and what drives food choice. My undergraduate degree was in psychology, and I ended up really pulling from that, merging my passions into food and culture. I do consider myself to be an activist. I'm a millennial. I think that's important to know. I'm also a mother. I do think that that impacts the way that I see the world. Today, we're going to be digging into part 2 of Hungry, avocado toast Instagram influencers and our search for connection and meaning. So today we're digging into the connection part. Part 2 is belonging, covering the themes that are in chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. Chapter 4 is influencers and loneliness. Chapter 5 is likes, upvotes, and self-esteem. Chapter 6 is all about diets and identity, diet tribes. And chapter 7 is about shared experiences and relatedness. Do you remember those shared experiences? We're not having very many of them. We're having kind of one unifying shared experience at this moment, but talking about what the ramifications of that are going to be. So I'll be doing this exact introduction for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to have a 20-minute Q&A with Dr. Brian Primack, who I'm thrilled to have here today. And then we're going to do a 20-minute group discussion. I encourage all of you, if you have questions as I'm talking with Dr. Primack, send in your questions. We want this to be interactive. We want you all to be speaking with one another. Depending on how many people we have logged in at the group discussion time, we might just ask you to unmute, share, but definitely feel free to start adding questions, comments as we go. So my work around food really has begun with this question of why. Why is it, this is really the question I started with, why is it that young people in particular are spending so much of their discretionary time and income on food? What is up with food culture becoming a part of the cultural zeitgeist at the same time that we were facing a global recession and the introduction of the digital age? It didn't make sense to me why even I, as a graduate student with very minimal income, was choosing to spend my money on underground dinners and fancy cheese at Whole Foods instead of paying for taxi cab rides or splurging to have someone else do my laundry, which in New York is one of those few things you can do for yourself. And what I really began to invest my time in to answer this question of why is, first, what is it that we need to feel well? Because what I ended up zeroing in on is that none of us are going to spend our discretionary time or income on something unless it's delivering on one of our core human needs. And so for Hungry, my work really started by doing an analysis of different theories of well-being. And actually next week, we're going to be talking to an expert on well-being, Dr. Keltner. But I looked at philosophies from psychologists, from neuroscientists, from religious leaders. It was really interesting to take all those theories, lay them out atop one another. And I was able to see that many, I would say actually all of the theories that I looked at fall into these 3 buckets. We all need to feel in control and safe. We need to feel like we're a part of a community and we belong. and we need to feel as though our lives have some sort of meaning or purpose. And today we're going to be focusing in on the community aspect of our well-being needs. So first, just starting with a quote from Brene Brown: "We are biologically, cognitively, physically, and spiritually wired to be loved, to love, and to belong. And when those needs are not met, we don't function as we were meant to. We break, we fall apart, we numb, we ache, we hurt others, we get sick." Today, we're going to be talking about the ramifications of what life is like when we do not feel that sense of community, or when we're trying to achieve that sense of community. So Francesca, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first poll, I'm going to ask all of you to answer this question. How much do you agree with the statement, "I wish I had a stronger community"? And I'm just going to give 1 minute for people to plug in their answers. And this is something that I actually asked of participants in the Hungry Study. The Hungry Study was a survey conducted with myself in collaboration with Data Central. We asked questions of 1,100 people across the United States about their emotional well-being, their attachment to technology, and also their relationships to food. So I am going to be revealing what the general population's answer was to this question when we surveyed them in 2019. But I'm very eager to see what the results are now. So Francesca, if you want to put up what the results are, I can't see. So I'm eager to see what people's responses are. I don't see it up on my screen. Oh, there we go. Oh, 48, wow. 48% are agree and 41% are slightly agree. Okay, this is actually more drastic than I was anticipating. I do think that we are all in this phase, right, of recognizing perhaps the lack of community in our lives. And I think this is also really important to note. We were actually already lonely prior to the pandemic. So this is in part why I'm so fascinated by this topic right now, why I want to keep doing research on this right now. As you can see, those numbers are pretty startling that we all just shared, right? Wishing you had a stronger community. It was almost every single one of us on this call today. And this was already trending prior to the pandemic. So everything that I'm going to be talking about today, the trends that were being really pushed forward in food and lifestyle culture as a response to loneliness, we can only expect those to become exacerbated in the months and years to come. So something just to keep in mind. Now, why is it that we were already lonely even prior to the pandemic? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. From a sociological side of things, right? People are moving away from family more frequently. People are less interested in organized religion. Many cultures are really following this capitalistic meritocracy approach. And a lot of people don't know their neighbors anymore. There's less of a neighborhood culture. So you can see here in our survey in the Hungry Study, 65 of the Gen Pop agreed or slightly agreed with the statement, "I wish I had a stronger community." So much, much higher with those of us on the call today. It was at 73% for millennials. We also asked a number of other questions related to loneliness, borrowing from the UCLA loneliness survey. And there we asked if I wanted to go on a day trip, I would have a hard time finding someone to go with me. 56% of millennials in 2019 agreed with that statement, and just under 59% of the Gen Pop. So Francesca, would you mind putting up the second and final poll, which is really looking at social media? Curious to know how people have been feeling about this. How much do you agree with the following statement, "My life is bettered by having access to, to social media"? Agree, slightly disagree, or disagree. And you might be thinking, well, what's the connection here between dissolution of community and the benefit of social media? Well, okay. I mean, how have we been able to connect with community over the last year? Mainly through social media. But even prior to the moment that we are in, many of us have been replacing our in-person connections with online connections. And that's really what we're going to get into today with Dr. Primack. So Francesca, whenever you feel like there's enough people who have clicked their option, you can reveal the answers to us. Okay, this is more of a split. All right, how much do you agree that your life is bettered by having access to social media? Almost half of you say you slightly agree. I think today's gonna be really interesting to dig into that ambivalence. right? Most people were in the slightly buckets, either slightly agreeing or slightly disagreeing. I myself have very mixed feelings about the role of social media in my life, and became even more skeptical, quite to be perfectly honest, while writing this book. Um, Now, one of the things that I did learn while doing research uh, for Hungary was really the issue that comes up when we are spending so much time with our social media quote friends. And this is an analogy that Dr. Primack gave me while I interviewed him for my book. And he said, oftentimes we're hungry for apples and we go online and we receive Apple Jacks. And it was in this interview that I started thinking about perhaps the rise in loneliness has something to do as well with the integration of social media within our lives. Are we, while looking for apples, just getting Apple Jacks and not receiving the full benefits of friendship that we really need? And it was super interesting. After my interview with Dr. Primack, I got the results from the Hungry study. And in that study, we were able to divide out people by Gen Pop and then also by number of followers on social media. And we asked a number again of questions related to loneliness and self-esteem. And here you can see that those in our research group who had over 500 Instagram followers, which I personally took to mean they spend a good amount of time on social media, they were more likely than the general population to agree or slightly agree with every single one of these statements. They desire a stronger community. They believe their friends are more successful than they are. They're more likely to feel left out. They're more likely to say that most of their relationships are superficial, more likely than the Gen Pop to say that they have no one to share their most private worries with. And they're more likely than the general population to say that they're often dissatisfied with themselves. This to me was really striking, right? Because you can do all the research, all the interviews in the world as a journalist. Part of the reason why I was so excited to actually run a survey myself was to test out a lot of these theories that I had been gathering through interviews. And it was pretty alarming, to be perfectly frank, to find this out, to see these numbers actually coming to fruition. Now, when you're really thinking about, well, what is the impact of social media on our well-being, right? We see the negative. It can pull us away from those in-person interactions. And I'll talk more about this with Dr. Primack. There are also benefits to social media. So this woman that you are watching here, her name's Min. Her performance name is Dudungli. And she is a mukbang BJ in South Korea. And she lives in the town right outside of Seoul. Mukbang translates into eating broadcast. More than a quarter of millennials and Gen Zers in South Korea watch mukbang. This is something that's become extremely popular over the last 5 years. Generally speaking, the mukbang broadcast jockey will set up their live stream, eat an enormous quantity of food. They usually have their microphones pretty close to their mouth, so you have this ASMR aspect. Some people are really turned on by this. Other people are really disgusted by it. I personally did not understand it when I first discovered this trend. And so what did I do? I flew to South Korea. I contacted this woman and I said, can I come over and talk to you? It was one of the most interesting interviews of my life. And when I was talking to Jujungli about why do you do this, and I'm going to go to the next slide just because I am in the boat of people who are like deeply disturbed by the slurping, though some people really enjoy it. So there's being Jujungli in her house. And I said to her, I was like, why are you doing this? She at that point in time was live streaming herself having dinner 5 nights a week. Every night, 7 nights a week. It was always at the same time. She would tell her followers like what she was going to be eating. She had about 200 people that watched her every evening eat dinner. But then she said there's 2 hours after that. There's 1 hour eating, 2 hours of conversation. And I said to her, I was like, well, when are you going to stop doing this? And she looked at me aghast and was like, why would I ever do that? These people are my family. And in talking to her and then doing additional investigation about the rising rates of loneliness in South Korea, what I was able to learn is that for Dudungli herself and her followers, social media and influencer culture was cultivating a community that she otherwise was missing in her life. And there are a lot of things happening in South Korea, the economic growth that is causing people to move away from their families. It is in such drastic contrast to really the Confucian base of South Korean culture. And a lot of people are suffering. And in the Hungry study, we were also able to look at, well, what is this attachment to influencers actually like for people? You know, what role is influencer culture playing in combating these rising rates of loneliness? 53% of the people in our study who follow an influencer, who said that they have a favorite influencer, said that when something bad happens to one of their favorite celebrities or influencers, they feel like it happened to them. And 45% said if they were lucky enough to meet their favorite influencer or celebrity, and they asked me to do something illegal as a favor, I'd probably do it. Again, I was just super, super fascinated by our ability using social media to feel as though we are cultivating a community, even if it's with somebody we have never met before. So I'm just going to quickly walk through the ways that our desire for belonging and these elevated rates of loneliness have been showing up in culture. And then I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Primack, and we can dig into really, why is this? Why are these things happening? How is social media playing a role, either to better or to worsen our desire for belonging? So first of all, of course, we have seen in culture over the last decade a dominant role for people really trying to gain social approval, right? We live in a world of likes, of upvotes. One of my favorite interviews of all time was with the late Anthony Bourdain, who was the first person to really talk to me about his sense of guilt in posting pictures of food. And he was like, because at the end of the day, really, when I'm posting about something delicious that I've eaten, I'm not really trying to share that experience with other people. I'm trying to brag. I want people to look up to me, to be envious, and gain that kind of social standing. And that conversation many years ago was really what got me also interested in this vein of research. But we also have seen an increasing number of people, and we'll get into this again as well, who are phubbing, which means paying attention to what's happening on your phone instead of what's happening in person. So the draw for social approval, the upvotes, the likes, can be so potent that sometimes we end up ignoring the people who are actually like right in the room with us or right around us. We are also seeing our desire for belonging show up through a desire to create identity, right? We used to have these societal and social structures that would tell us, give us some guidance, reduce the number of choices we had to make. That would tell us what to wear, what to eat, the way to talk. We don't really have that anymore. That can be very overwhelming for people to try to craft their own identity. And so many of us are actually turning to food culture as that filter for identity. As for the research for the book, I went to a vegan speed dating event in New York City. Super interesting to talk to people who were trying to find a partner who shared their vegan value systems. Also really interesting conversations and animosity revealed between the vegan and vegetarian community, asking people whether they would ever marry a vegetarian. I got some very passionate responses to that. But again, looking at how are people identifying themselves in culture right now by what they don't eat. How are people expressing themselves through the value systems that are imbued within their ways of eating? We're also seeing this outside of food culture, right? It's the Bernie bros, people taking on these kind of cultural identities in politics. It's also performative a lot of the time. This past year, I felt this way with the Black boxes, with the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, what was that about? Like, was it really an act of solidarity with the Black community? I guess we can have a debate about that. I personally think it was an identity performance. It was saying, hey, people, I have this value system, which was good to have so many people performing that at the same time. There's also, of course, gaining interest in heritage and ancestry. Again, helping us really link to our identity, to find who we are. And then desire for belonging had, prior to the pandemic, been showing up in shared experiences. We had the sharing economy. Think about how restaurant culture changed over the last decade, right? You have, again, rise of the digital age, rise of the foodie movement, and rise of open kitchens, shared tables, shared plates. The restaurant culture became more community-centric. We also saw this in fitness. Big box gyms had decreasing numbers of people who were going to their gym places. Instead, the money was going towards boutique gyms. And I would personally anticipate this is going to be a major boom once it's safe for us to go do this again, right? But the money was going to Orange Theory, or to whatever boutique gym where you could go and see the same people every single week and develop relationships. Over the last few months, how has this desire been playing out? Mainly like TikTok, co-streaming, all of us baking the same things at the same times, right? It's the hashtag banana bread or babka. What I'm eager to talk about with all of you today, because I do not have these answers at all, but how is this desire for belonging and these record high rates of loneliness, how is this going to show up in culture post-COVID? How is this going to shape our realities? You know, my best guess is that we're going to be more focused on our regions, on local talent, on local flavors. I believe that there's going to be a resurgent interest in our ancestry, right? Looking for that sense of belonging in a new place. And in many ways, while we're still isolated, the only way to do that is by looking backwards or looking at the family photo albums if you're back home with mom and dad. I would also anticipate, right, that moving forward, diet identities and IRL experiences are going to, again, be top of mind for people. So thank you very much for listening. If you do want to learn more about Hungry, you can go to hungrybook.com, about me at eveturopal.com. Just a reminder, feel free, add questions to the chat at any point in time. And now I just want to welcome to the stage Dr. Brian Primack. And I am going to stop sharing my screen. Dr. Primack, hello, welcome.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you
Great.
so much for joining us. Will you just give a brief introduction to this crowd, tell people who you are, what you do, and where you are joining us from today?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Brian Primack. I am joining you from Arkansas. I'm the Dean of Education and Health at the University of Arkansas. I've had a little bit of a twisty career. I was a school teacher for the first 5 years of my professional life, everywhere from West Africa to inner city Boston. I started getting more interested in kids with more challenges. And so I got a master's degree in psychology and education. I started to think about potentially becoming a child therapist. I eventually went to medical school. I decided to become a family practitioner along the way because it was more sort of the behavioral stuff I was really looking for. So I'm, connecting with your psychology background, Eve. That is very clear from reading your book that psychology is just throughout there. And then I was finally able to kind of put some of these things together in terms of researching health education. And I guess that's what, comes to me today. I also have, been developing more administrative roles and enjoying those in the past. I've been the dean of students of a school, but then I've also been the dean of the Honors College at the University of Pittsburgh. And but now I'm really excited to be in a place where we really combine health and education. And then finally, I'm really glad to be here today. The book is fabulous. I have to admit that, at the beginning, when the idea seemed to be connecting food and psychology and technology and society and generational differences, I was like, how is this possibly going to be done? But you absolutely did it. I mean, it's fascinating. And I appreciate that you're making it so that folks can participate in this, whether or not they've actually read the book. But I really recommend for everybody to read it because there's so many little vignettes. There's so many little ideas. You just talked about Min and hearing even more specifically what she was talking about in terms of those 2 hours after her broadcast. I agree with you. I'm sort of repulsed by, even those few moments of watching this, but these people really are having these deep connections. And you are also in your book often talking about Maslow and, that need for that really deep need for belonging and connection, and those kind of, specific stories are just so valuable. The one that I was just telling a friend about is where I had no idea that you could pay $100 to somebody to take care of your Instagram feed for you for a couple of hours so that you can actually rest on vacation. Because the fear is, if I'm actually posting, or if I'm not posting for a couple of, did this actually happen? And so anyway, so thank you so much for the book and for just all of that research and those details that you brought out, just I think really brilliantly.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Coming from you, it means a lot. And in the book, I actually relied pretty heavily on the research that you and your colleagues had done on the emotional implications of time spent on social media. So I'd love to just dig into that a little bit. In my research, I saw study after study indicating that use of social media is correlated with emotional health conditions like depression, anxiety, and loneliness. And one of the questions that I keep getting from folks who I'm talking to is, well, is it the chicken or the egg? Is social media use causing the negative emotional conditions, or are people who are more prone to those negative conditions just attracted to social media use?
Yeah. So Eve, that is sort of the big question. And interestingly, when I talked to you before, I didn't really have the answer, because most of our studies had been, well, really all of our studies had been cross-sectional. As you describe in chapter 5 of the book, that whole idea that I was thinking, well, what's the relationship going to be between, say, social media and depression? And I really thought it was going to look kind of like a U. You described this in the book. I really thought it was going to be like, if you don't ever use social media, you might be more sad because you don't have those connections. If you use a ton and you're not doing anything else with your life, maybe you also feel sad. But those middle grounds of use might be sort of, lower your depression. So there was the sort of U-shaped curve, but we didn't find that. We found this straight line where every increase in social media was related to an increase in depression. But like you're saying, at that time, we didn't really know what was chicken and egg. We knew that these two things were going together. People that were using more social media were more depressed. And by the way, also more anxious and more lonely. But we really didn't know the direction. And it could be either one. Because, there certainly are some theoretical reasons why you might say, if I'm on social media all the time, there are things on there that are making me more depressed in terms of more social comparison. I could be doing other things, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. But it could absolutely be the other way around. In other words, it could be that people who are already depressed are just flocking to social media because they don't want to go out and actually see people in person. So I think what you're asking is a critical question. And I'm happy to say that we really are starting to answer it. Like I said, last time I talked to you, we hadn't, but we just published a paper literally 2 months ago in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And this is what we found. What we found is we, for the first time, watched people over the course of 6 months. And so it was the first longitudinal study. And what we did was 2 chunks. The first was to start with people who were non-depressed, and then to watch them over time and say, okay, the folks that became depressed, was there any relationship with the amount of social media that they used? And sure enough, we found a really dramatic line. So the people who used more social media were much, much more likely at baseline, were much, much more likely over the next 6 months to become depressed. But the thing that really, I think, brought the point home is that we also looked in the other direction. We said, okay, let's start by looking at depressed people and seeing if they start to use more social media or not. And there was absolutely no relationship. So it really did seem to start answering the question of the chicken and the egg, in the sense that it really does seem directional, that, you know, people who use more social media are more likely over the next 6 months to become more depressed, but people who are depressed don't really seem to start using more social media. At least in this study, and it was, you know, over 1,000 people, nationally representative. I mean, obviously one study can't answer it. We need to do more in terms of figuring this out, but I think that it's very relevant to a lot of the themes you discuss in your book.
So what I'm curious about, so right now we're in this really critical moment. We had record high rates of loneliness, again, pre-pandemic, and the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has written an entire book about this. And he had said that he was actually, his number one health concern for Americans was not obesity, it was loneliness. Yeah. And there are physical health impacts of being lonely. And we're now likely going to see even higher rates of loneliness, right? And we've been spending a whole lot of time on our phones and our screens. I'm sure that you're aware that the CDC came out this summer with pretty alarming statistics around the rates of suicide and suicidal thoughts for teens. What are you most concerned about? I mean, you're dealing with the Gen Z population on a day-to-day basis. Your history is with youth and education. You know, what concerns you most as it relates to teens' mental health and the role of social media in their lives?
So, so you're absolutely right. There's no question that we're in an epidemic of loneliness. The England recently, the UK created their most recent cabinet post for the Minister of Loneliness. Normally we think of ministers as like, defense or housing or something like that. And now there's a minister of loneliness. Suicide is at an all-time, well, not necessarily all-time, but it's certainly in the past 30-year high.
In modern history, yeah.
Yeah, in modern history, exactly. And so these things are extremely concerning. And, then related to sort of this overall discussion, what do we do about this? And, obviously social media, as an example, is something that we really can imagine could have positive effects or could have negative effects in this way. When I read about, Min and her followers, they really feel a kinship to each other. So maybe that is somehow supporting, Maslow's general idea that you described of, love and affection and belongingness needs, but on the other hand, we have these, research results that actually show sort of the opposite, that when people use more social media in general, then they actually feel more lonely. That was also a paper that was published in American Journal of Preventive Medicine. And again, very surprising. I mean, we sort of understood, depression and anxiety, but we really were very surprised that you actually feel lonelier if you're spending more time with these 700 friends. And hence that idea of apples versus Apple Jacks, the sense that sometimes there is a valuable replacement for something. In some ways, does an emoji kind of make you feel good? It does. I mean, right? Like I see an emoji next to someone's name when they, sign something, and it is a little bit of, it does sort of capture a little bit of that feeling. But of course, it's not really a replacement for the 43 muscles in the human face and, the sort of interaction that we have really truly come to need as social beings. And in the introduction of your book, you talk about sort of that cave mentality, like we still have these cave brains, but then we have this very, very new world. And sure enough, social media, even the term social media, has only been around for about 20 years. And so, so if the brains that are used to, deeply needing, true social cues, like, in-person relationship and auditory and, and smiles and interaction and physicality, et cetera, are we able to replace this or not? And I think, the jury is really still out. I mean, I think we should try, because I think in a lot of ways, there aren't that many options. I mean, society is going to a different space than it has been in the past. My first job out of college was teaching in West Africa, and and there was a village, and everybody ate the same thing every day, right? So very different than what you're describing food-wise. Everybody was connected. Nobody ate alone, like you saw with your Korean people that you were describing. And they're the happiest people I've ever met in my life, even though it was considered by the World Health Organization to be the second most miserable country in the world. So I apologize for the long, twisty answer to your simple question, but absolutely, it's a huge concern, and I'm not sure the direction that we need to go.
Right, because I'm intrigued by people's response to this question of, has social media on the whole been an improvement? And I think that based on the research that I was able to dig into, the critical issue with social media, yes, it's the perfectionism, yes, it's the comparisons to other people, but it really becomes an issue when you're replacing your in-person interactions with those that are online. So giving up time that you would have spent with others in person because you're looking at your phone, you're posting something on Instagram, or even planning something in real life to optimize a social media experience, which is what I saw when I was shadowing high school students. We're in this unique moment, though, where we don't have the option for the in-person experience. And so I do think that in many ways, social media became a friendlier place. There wasn't as much to brag about. Like, you didn't have some great adventure to make someone envious about, right? Social media became a place where we were offering tips, helping each other cope, saying, I'm experiencing the same thing. And that, to me, is on the positive spectrum. You have a new book coming out, your first book, so congratulations. You Are What You Click. Everyone should pre-order it on Amazon. I see Julia just did, so yay. Everyone go order Dr. Primack's book. But the book's foundation is really about how do we use social media responsibly. So I'm curious to know, what are the top 3 tips you can provide me, our audience members, on how to appropriately use social media to optimize our well-being instead of allowing it to hinder our well-being?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think we saw, in the poll that you put up, we saw that ambivalence, right? It was for the second question. The first one was pretty, unambiguous in terms of everybody wants more community. But in terms of, how has social media been for you? It was really interesting that, very few people, 1 in 10, agreed, said, oh, yes, it's definitely as good. But most people did say, well, slightly. I do think that it's, whatever. But then there were a fair number of people. I mean, in total, 43% of people said either slightly disagree or disagree completely. So that's kind of half and half. We're saying either slightly or I disagree. And I think that it sort of captures all of our experiences, because we've all had both positive and negative experiences. And like you're saying, we can look back on the time during COVID and say, of course, I had some really positive experiences. I was able to connect with people that I hadn't. I was able to get information that, and so we certainly don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, and say okay, this isn't 100% positive, and so let's all go live at the top of a mountain somewhere and completely deny our, society. That just isn't, what we can do. So I think, what we try to do is sort of, for the first time, develop a little bit of a sort of a food pyramid, as it were, related to social media. And so, because it's similar, in the 1970s, we were getting all of these, studies, that basically every kind of food was bad for you in some way or another. Don't eat carbs, don't eat saturated fats, don't eat, any trans fats. That's even worse. And, et cetera, et cetera. And, you sort of get to these Venn diagrams, and you also describe this in the part of your book where you're talking about fad diets and your identity in your diet and things like that. And all of a sudden there's almost nothing left, And so the idea was that public health people tried to respond by saying, well, we shouldn't stop eating. We can't stop eating. So instead, what we need is some kind of a guideline. And so that's the whole idea. But to get to your more specific, it's a great question. What are kind of three pearls? Well, I would say like one pearl is that a lot of our studies sort of over and over again are seem to be showing that it's better to focus your social media world on people who are already close, who maybe are people, say, for example, who you've already met face to face. Now, I realize that some people on this call might say like, well, don't you always focus on face to face? But no, not at all. I mean, today in today's world, when we did our studies, we're finding that on average, 30 to 40% of your social media friends are people that you've never actually met face to face. And is that a terrible thing? Well, I mean, sometimes it's a great thing because you're meeting somebody who has some kind of a connection with you. But I think that there's more of a potential cost. We're just learning that it's those kinds of relationships that can lead to more of the gaffes, that could lead to more of the depression, that can lead to more of the challenges. And so if you want to be, totally, or I don't want to say totally safe, but safer, you may want to focus on people who are really already close friends and then just kind of extend those relationships in that way. It's not to say that there isn't ever a value in, making a connection with somebody that you didn't know before. I'm really glad to make the connection with you, and I didn't know you before. But it just, a lot of our studies are demonstrating that those are more of the sort of tricky things. Now that being said, it's hard because we as a society, we're collectors, we want more friends. If I can have 800 instead of 700, that's better, right? Our brains are kind of wired that way, and marketing definitely, sort of adds to that. And the way the platforms are set up, they want us to have more connections. And so they are more likely to steer me toward things that have more discussion because it's going to sell more and it's going to be more valuable for the advertisers. So it becomes very difficult to actually engage in this kind of process where you're almost like Marie Kondoing your friends,
Yeah.
And you're and you don't want to think of like doing that to people. But we talk in the book about how it's not like if you are not including somebody in a particular list or something like that, that it's like they've been snapped away by Thanos. It's like that person still exists. You can still find them. It's not that hard. But it still is very difficult. So that's the kind of thing that we try to do. So, that's one example. I'll quickly, since you said three things, I would say another thing that's really important is to really think about your personality. Because like, obviously if I'm, very scared of heights, like I'm not going to become a skydiver. But right now, a lot of people are using social media in a way that isn't really optimized for their personality. So we actually have, like in the book, a personality test. And then based on the results of that, actual, sort of suggestions as to, they're based on some of our research in terms of, different ways sort of that are more meshed potentially with your personality. And then I would say that the third sort of nugget. Oh, I'm sorry.
I said it's like a personalized social media diet.
I guess it is sort of like a personalized social media diet. Yeah. And it's a good point. And I would say that third chunk might be something about media literacy, something about just that, that there is sort of media literacy with regard to standard media. We teach kids to analyze and evaluate these days, not only in classrooms, not only poems by Shakespeare, but also advertisements that they're going to be, seeing. Well, we also need to, I think, bring that same kind of analysis and evaluation to our social media lives, because I think that we often don't do that. We think to ourselves, well, clearly this tequila advertisement is, that's not real life, because those are actors and they've been paid and made up. But what we don't realize is that our social media feeds are also not real life. I mean, we feel like they are because these are real people that we know or have known at one point or another. But on the other hand, that feed has been curated so incredibly heavily that it is almost as curated as a tequila advertisement in some ways. And it's even potentially more powerful because it's someone that I can relate to because they are my age and I used to know them, and that kind of thing. So we talk about, how to sort of bring that sort of realization and analysis and evaluation to ourselves, to our kids, etc.
Yeah. So I'm going to hop over into the chat box because we have a lot of really great, interesting questions that have been coming in. And a lot of these are about like what's going to happen based on the fact that we've been spending so much time on social media. I want to first go to Sina's question, which has to do with this really, how do we adapt to this reality? Last week, we talked to Dr. Daniel Levitin, who was saying, we're still functioning with brains that were evolved for life as it was 20,000 years ago. A lot of these questions that we're seeing, and the suggestions that you're making around a social media diet are about ways of coping and adapting. So Sina asks, how do you think how we feel and receive love will change? Meaning kids growing up with and being used to more online than offline engagement, will they be able to process online smileys differently than we do now? What are your thoughts on that?
Basically, yes. There's no question that society is going to change. There's no question that, there's even, social Darwinism. Now that we have this completely new culture, people that are, more, comfortable with utilizing this kind of communication are going to succeed, right? There's a totally different set of rules now in terms of, it used to be that, we would talk about like, well, if you're really looking to get that job, you need a firm handshake, you need to look at the person in the eye, etc. Things like, well, handshakes very well may be gone. Who knows? We're doing fist bumps even among people who are all vaccinated in our college, and beyond that, like, so now all of a sudden, because this mode of communication is important, I need to think about how I'm curating my light. And I know I'm not doing a great job of that right now because it's still new to me, but the thing is that like all of a sudden there really are very, very different sort of rules to life. And that is going to be reflected in society. So let me just give one other example. So, the Lincoln Douglas debates, the structure of those, not that long ago. I guess 150 years ago or whatever. So the structure of those was that, a person would just talk for an hour and a half and everyone would just listen to them for an hour and a half. And in today's world, a political soundbite is, whatever it is between 4 and 6 seconds. Yeah. And so it's a completely different set of skills that makes somebody, a politician. and all of a sudden, things are very, very different. You sort of talk about this a little bit in this section of the book that we read for today, about the labels of, I'm Bob and I'm Paleo from Denver. It's like, that's how you introduce yourself these days, as opposed to a full story, a full, and this has happened in the academic world as well. We used to write papers that were like we used to write books. Well, first of all, it would be an 80,000 word book. Well, then it became sort of, a mini book of 30,000 words and then a 10,000 word paper. Well, now a lot of journals that I submit to are 3,000 word papers. And not only that, but they want an abstract that's 250 words that really says the whole thing. And then they want a little section that's what this paper adds, that's 3 bullet points. I mean, soon they're going to ask me for a haiku to basically say, basically my whole idea about the world. And this is what you're seeing with these challenges of labeling, like, I'm a vegan. Well, but there's a lot of complexity there, like what kind of vegan are you? And, there's all of these different,
yeah,
exactly. The way you talk in the book about the intergroup divisions and, just like when you said Catholic, is it like Catholic and Protestant? Yes. And, yeah, so I think that there's no question that this is going to change society, and it's less of a question of will it, but it's more of a question of how, and then what do we, how do we respond to that in a way that, as much as possible, continues to help us get those very, very basic needs that you keep describing of Maslow's love and affection and belongingness, but doesn't end up losing exactly those things. And it's just that, there is some irony in that a lot of the ways that we use social media actually make us lose those things, but some things about it make us gain those things. How do we figure out the balance?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just going to kind of build onto what Ellen wrote in the chat, which is also about, how we've adapted to this moment and how is that going to impact us moving forward. Talk to any marketer. They say you create new behaviors when people are in a moment of disruption. And we've been able to see that, right? We've all been in a moment of disruption. We've all taken on new habits rapidly. And we're going to go through another one of those transitions as the world starts to go back to normal. But the question I think that Ellen's asking is like, well, how much of these COVID specific habits that we've taken on as it relates to how we connect socially, how long is that going to take, or is that ever going to go away when we go back to quote unquote normal? I mean, I can say personally, I am, Ellen, expecting some trepidation. I do think that there's going to be social anxiety as we all get used to these interactions again. I think there's going to be latent fears. I've also been talking to a lot of people who say, I'm never going back to traveling the way that I traveled for work. I'm never going back to the office the way that I did before. Dr. Primack, I'm wondering if you have a different take on things, and if that kind of hybrid now, virtual and in life existence that we're kind of talking about, is that going to be even worse for our mental health? Or can it be managed through these things like a social media food pyramid and literacy education for our kids? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so like an academic, I'm going to say a little bit of both, but I do think truly that it is a little bit of both. I mean, I would say that there certainly is going to be some pendulum swinging back, right? Because there is a groundswell at this point of people realizing, oh my gosh, loneliness is a problem, and there's a lot of our technical world that is contributing to that. And Dan Levitin mentioned, and I love his ideas and his books also. And it doesn't, today's world doesn't really fit with our brain. This is a critical idea, and so people are going to say, we need to prioritize in-person things somehow. So an example is, we in the academic worlds are completely rethinking what a library is, right? Because a library used to be the only place that you could actually go to get, information. And so it was, this very, very social, a place, and, people were kind of forced to see each other. And then people would meet each other, just sort of impromptu. Well, today, you don't need to go to the library to look that book up because it's on like that, it's on your Kindle, or you don't need to go, look up that article because like that, it's in your, email and you're reading it, et cetera, et cetera. So libraries have been totally reimagining themselves as almost like community centers, and so what they're doing is they're saying, well, people aren't going to come for the same reason. They're not going to go to the card catalog and look through there. But, so we need to create our space in different ways. Cities do this now. There's a whole like urban design, world where, we're realizing, oh my gosh, the built environment is really problematic. And so there are all kinds of people in architecture and in urban planning who are saying, we need to create parks so that people will walk again because they're not walking because of what we've, created. And so I do think that there is going to be some pendulum swinging back in that ways. But on the other hand, there are going to be certain things that are always going to be, different. You mentioned again, in Korea, the way it used to be that someone would say, "Oh my gosh, no one would ever eat alone," and now, many people are eating alone. That's not gonna, we can try to introduce pyramids and behavioral things and educational things to change this, but that's not necessarily going to change. We're not going to go back to where you stand in the line at the bank every week depositing your paycheck, and that you get social connection that way. Or when you go to a grocery store, you're always going to be interacting with at least one person. Not many people don't even go to grocery stores anymore. So yes, certain things are definitely going to change, but are there going to be ways that we can, think about the, sort of merging, like the way libraries have changed, like the way built environment? Yes, I think there will be some of that as well.
Yeah. Well, we do have to wrap up because it's already at the end of the hour. I want to thank everybody for coming, especially Dr. Primack. Thank you so much for talking to us about this topic of technology, loneliness, and culture. Just kind of in closing, bringing this back to food culture and the role of food culture. I do think, Ellen, you had this comment in here. I do think that there is going to be extra space, building on the library concept, where we're going to see value in meeting in person. I personally think that restaurants are going to be the first kind of prototyping grounds for this, right? We connect over meals. And the restaurant industry so badly needs our love and attention and dollars these days, particularly of your local independent establishments. So I do think that food culture is going to kind of play that immediate role as bringing community together. But thank you again, everybody, for joining. Next week will be our last book club event with Professor Dr. Keltner, who is going to talk about the science of happiness and well-being. And I'm super excited for that. So thank you all again for spending your time with us. If there's any follow-up questions, comments, feel free, contact me through my website, eveturopaul.com, or feel free, send me a direct email at eve@eveturopaul.com. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope that you go give someone you love a hug, a high five, a fist bump, get some eye-to-eye contact in today, and think about how to Marie Kondo your social media feed. If you do it, let me know how it goes. I'm curious to know. I did it myself, so I'm happy to talk to people about it. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening.
Thanks, Eve.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Hi, Sarah.